When I was in the Renovari Institute spiritual formation program, one of the primary teachers in that program's name was Trevor Hudson, actually. Turns out he's South African and white South African pastor, and gotten to know him pretty well and hear some of the stuff that Phil was talking about, the racial tension in South Africa, and it's been really great, and I have a lot of admiration for him. But he said one time during one of the lectures that he was giving that your ideas of God and their associated images are the most important thing about you. Now, let me just let that soak with you for a second. Your ideas of God and their associated images are the most important thing about you. So when you think about God, when somebody is talking with you about God, what are the images that come to your mind? What are the ideas and what are the images? We communicate ideas often with images, don't we? We communicate ideas with language that often brings images with it. And perhaps if we had to break down the idea of theology to the very simplest definition, we could say that theology is your ideas about God and how you articulate them. Because as we'll see in a minute, theology really is just words about God. It's kind of broken down that way. But what's important about our ideas about God and those associated images is that really drives how we relate to Him. When you think about the words that you would associate with God, some of those words would draw you to Him, and some of those words maybe would push you away, or maybe images that other people have given you. Even if you don't even believe in God, right? Even for a person who would say, I'm an atheist, there are words and images attached to that. That's thinking and articulating about God. And it would impact how you live out your life in the world. In the Brothers K, Dostoevsky said that if there's no God, then everything is permitted. Think about that idea, right? So if there's no God, if your theology is that there's no God, then everything is permitted. Now you might be able to say, well, still we could come up with an ethic, and that's true. We probably would, wouldn't we? Like we would say, well, here's what we think, and maybe it would be a matter of pragmatism. As a matter of pragmatism, here's how we live. We don't kill each other just because, we want to. It's just better that way. We might say, it is better that way. I like it better that way. But there's no ought to it, right? You can't say you ought not to do this or you ought to do that unless you can articulate that from some transcendent sort of place. In a letter that Dostoevsky wrote to a friend, he said, now suppose there is no God or immorality of the soul. Now tell me, why should I live righteously and do good deeds if I die entirely on earth? And what he's saying is, if this is all there is, like if this truly is all there is and there's nothing to it, this is all random and chance and, there's just whatever, then what stops me? And why should I not, at least as much as it depends on my intelligence and agility to avoid being caught by the law, why should I not cut the throat of another man? Why not? What he's saying is, well, if I'm pretty good at being bad, what keeps me from wanting something that my neighbor has and cutting his throat to take it? I mean, you can't really say, apart from there being some transcendent truth, you can't really say, well, you shouldn't do that. Well, maybe because you like my neighbor, but is there a transcendent reason not to do it, is what he's saying. And so our impact in the world, our way of walking the world out is rooted so much in our view of God and its associated images, our ideas and their images. And so while on atheism you might be able to say, and I think people do say this, there is an ethic, and let's agree on it as a society, and and that's better than nothing to be sure, it's difficult to say, no, this is what it ought to be, over someone else's, this is what it ought to be. And so we can see that our view of God really does impact how we live out our lives in the world. If we believe that God is a tyrant, so maybe we're not an atheist, but we are a theist, we believe God is a tyrant, and he's really looking for every opportunity that he can to knock us down or push us back or cut us out. We're going to relate to him in a certain way, mostly avoidance, right? I mean, think about if you've had relationships with people like that, people who are always, like they look for every opportunity to hurt you, or it feels like you're always being hurt in those relationships. What I encourage people to do in those relationships is get out, like distance, right? That's a good thing. You don't want to be in relationships that are hurting you, that are breaking you down. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be in relationships where people challenge you and confront you. That's not the point. But if you're in relationships where you're being hurt, that's not a good idea. If your view of God, your idea of God is Father, and that's an idea that's communicated a lot in Scripture, and we sang about that today. But you know, we've heard people say, look, don't tell me about Father. I don't have a great experience with that. Like my dad wasn't around. My dad just beat me up all the time. My dad was hard on me. My dad didn't, I mean, maybe he loved me. He said he did, but it didn't feel that way. So please don't use the image of God as Father, because that's not an appealing image to me. But then that's going to impact the way you behave, the way you relate. What is your idea about God, and what are the associated images? Maybe, and I think a lot of people think this way about God, he's just a really nice old fellow who really wants everyone to get along. Be nice. Just be nice. How many of you have said that before? Just be nice. Well, that's better than nothing, right? But if you think about that way, like you probably don't know this, but I'm now a grandfather. If Vida's discipline comes down to me, exactly. Right? I was actually thinking about this yesterday. Like, could I really no, you can't do that. I think I could. Ryan, maybe. But you know what I mean? It's like, she's going to know, right? Like we were, one day a couple of weeks ago, my wallet was on the ottoman in the family room, and she grabbed it, and Josh said, Dad, Vida's got your wallet. I said, oh, you have no idea. She's got all of it, right? She's got all of it. And she's going to know it someday, right? So if our idea about God is he's this kindly old grandfather who gives us whatever we want, whenever we want it, that's going to impact a great deal about how we relate to him and to others, isn't it? So our ideas about God and their associated images are really important. And so theology is really that. Dallas Willard said, theology is a part of our lives. It's unavoidable. A thoughtless theology guides our lives with as much force as a thoughtful and informed one. Think about that. Theology is a part of our lives. It's unavoidable. You're doing theology even if you don't know it. A thoughtless theology guides our lives with as much force as a thoughtful and informed one. Think about this. When life has been going really good for you, and then suddenly it takes a bad turn and something really hard happens to you, and you say, why is God doing this to me? What is that? It's theology, isn't it? Yeah, it's theology, because what you're saying is, my image of God, my idea of God, and the associated images is, he's a father who's going to discipline me whenever I do the wrong thing. And I did the wrong thing, and so he's disciplining me. That's going to be the image. Or, if you having an amazing year and financially everything's good and everything's working in your relationships, and if somebody says, how's it going? You say, God is really blessing me. You know what that is? It's theology. You might not say it, like you might not say, well, let me tell you my theology of how I'm doing. You wouldn't say it, but you are doing theology right there, because it's a part of how you're thinking about God. And sometimes as Christians we say, we need to spend less time thinking about theology. Theology really doesn't matter. We really just need to love God more and spend less time on the heady stuff of faith and more time on the feeling and living out stuff of faith. And while I don't think that's completely wrong, sometimes I think what that is a laziness that says, I'm not really going to drill down. I'm not really going to pay attention to what God is about and what God is like. And really anybody's idea is just as good as anyone else's. Because what we need to say about God and theology is that everyone's idea isn't as good as everyone else's. Like there are things that are true and things that are not. And we can be lazy and come to a place where it's just like, hey, whatever, however works for you, that's great. But that's not really how things are. And so we don't want to be lazy as it comes to faith. We don't want to be lazy as it comes to theology, because we have a theology. It may be thoughtless and uninformed, but we have one. And so why does theology matter? That's one of the questions that came up in this series. It matters because it really does guide how we live. Sometimes we forget what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22. It says, but when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, which I expect made them very happy, by the way, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Now this is the great and first commandment. And the second's like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And if you do these things, you got it down. We get heart, soul. Sometimes we forget mind, right? Love the Lord your God with all your mind. Theology matters because it's thinking about who God is, and it's thinking about how to articulate that. So, really specifically, what is theology and how we're doing it? How are we doing it? Well, we've already talked a little bit about how we're doing it. We're doing it because we're going to live in the world the way we see it. We're really working out. We can't live in contradiction to our beliefs, our real beliefs. Now, I know we can have stated beliefs and then our real beliefs. Our stated beliefs are the ones that we articulate sometimes and go, well, this is what I believe. Our actual beliefs are the ones we live according to, right? And so we're doing theology because we're living according to our actual beliefs. And often they're the same, don't get me wrong. Often our stated beliefs and our actual beliefs are the same thing, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes we know the right answers, but it doesn't really connect with us at a deep level of our soul. But theology is quite literally words about God, right? If we break down the word theology, you have theos, which is God in the Greek language, and logos, which is word in the Greek language. So we talk about theology, we're talking about words about God. That's really as simple, as it can kind of get. Webster's dictionary defines it this way, a little less simple, but I think interesting. Theology is this: the science of God or of religion, the science which treats of the existence, character, and attributes of God, his laws and government, the doctrines we are to believe, and the duties we are to practice. The science of Christian faith and life. That's what it really is. Augustine said that theology is the rational discussion respecting the deity. So theology is specifically words about God. It's the science of God. It's who he actually is. So when you think about theology, we can think about it as a list of doctrines and big, thick books with really complicated language, or we can think about it as words about God. It can be that simple, right? And so we got to think a little bit about how we view theology. I like this definition. Theology is a set of intellectual and emotional commitments, justified or not, about God and man, which dictate one's beliefs and actions. So now, I like that because what it says there is, it's this list of beliefs, justified or not. They can be intellectual or emotional commitments that are justified or not. You can have beliefs about God that aren't justified. They will still change how you live. Isn't that right? You're still going to live according to, even if they're wrong, you're going to live according to them because that's what you believe. I remember one of my New Testament professors, really fun guy to go to class with, but he was an old, grumpy guy. Dr. Ford was his name. And he would say this: you're never going to argue a person out of a position they weren't argued into. In other words, there are times when we hold ideas about things that are emotional, that are visceral, and somebody comes along and tries to talk us out of those ideas. Well, you can't talk us out of those ideas because they didn't get there by being talked in. And so sometimes our theology, whether it's justified or not, right? Our theology is going to, whether it's justified or not, really set in motion how we're going to walk out life in the world. And so it's really important that we think about what our picture of God is, and it's really critical because it's going to shape how we live. And so that's why Trevor Hudson says, right, the single most important thing about us is our idea of God and its associated images. An interesting quote by William Temple that the first time I read it, I wasn't quite sure if I believed it or not. But he says this: if our picture of God is wrong, the more religious we get, the worse it gets, and we would be better off atheists. Let that soak in for a minute. What he's saying is, if we have really wrong ideas about God, maybe ideas that would cause us to actually take other people hostage, or ideas that will cause us to batter other people, or that create really dysfunctional relationships. If our ideas about God are wrong, if our picture of God is wrong, the more religious we get, the worse it gets, and we would be better off atheists. I mean, that's a pretty challenging statement. But he's just saying the importance of theology, the importance of our ideas, of our picture of God is so critical. If we get it really wrong, we'll use it really to hurt people. And I bet if I went around this room right now, every one of us could pick out times in our lives when we've been involved with religious people that frankly it was destructive and broken and really did hurt. And that just comes from the wrong ideas of God. And so we have to be really attentive to our view of God. We don't want to have a skewed picture of God. And sometimes what we do is we want to create God in our own image, don't we? Voltaire said it this way: in the beginning, God created man in his own image, and man has been trying to return the favor ever since. Let me invite you to think about this for just a second. You should probably be concerned if God loves all the people you love and hates all the people you hate. I know. You're like, well, I don't hate anyone. Okay, let's pretend for a minute that you kind of do. Let's just pretend for a minute there are people you really don't like. If God likes all the people you like and dislikes all the people you dislike, there's a likelihood you've created God in your own image, because you're probably not always going to get it right. And I think that we can get that to that place where, we think God always agrees with us. And we create our own theology around what we think God thinks, because we think what God thinks is what we think. And so theology is really important. We have to be attentive to it. We have to be attentive to what we actually believe and recognize that there's something bigger than our own experience of God and our ideas about God, but they're important, but there's something bigger than that. I love this section in Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis writes about this idea, and I can't say it better than he says it, so I'm going to read it to you, and we all like reading, so let me read to you for just a few minutes. He says this. This is the last book of Mere Christianity, so it's sectioned into books. He says, everyone has warned me not to tell you what I am going to tell you in this last book. They all say the ordinary reader does not want theology. Give him plain, practical religion. I have rejected their advice. I do not think the ordinary reader is such a fool. Theology means the science of God, and I think any man who wants to think about God at all would like to have the clearest and most accurate ideas about him which are available. You're not children. Why should you be treated like children? In a way, I quite understand why some people are put off by theology. I remember once when I had been giving a talk to the RAF, an old hard-bitten officer got up and said, I've no use for all that stuff, but, mind you, I am a religious man too. I know there's a God. I've felt him out alone in the desert at night, the tremendous mystery. And that's just why I don't believe all your neat little dogmas and formulas about him. To anyone who's met the real thing, they all seem so petty and pedantic and unreal. Now, in a sense, I quite agree with that man. I think he had probably had a real experience of God in the desert. And when he turned from that experience to the Christian creeds, I think he really was turning from something real to something less real. In the same way, if a man has once looked at the Atlantic from the beach and then goes and looks at a map of the Atlantic, he also will be turning from something real to something less real, turning from real waves to a bit of colored paper. But here comes the point. The map is admittedly only colored paper, but there are two things you have to remember about it. In the first place, it is based on what hundreds and thousands of people have found out by sailing the real Atlantic. In that way, it has behind it masses of experience, just as real as the one you could have had from the beach. Only while yours would be a single glimpse, the map fits all those different experiences together. In the second place, if you want to go anywhere, the map is absolutely necessary. As long as you are content with walks on the beach, your own glimpses are far more fun than looking at a map. But the map is going to be more useful than walks on the beach if you want to get to America. So that idea, right, that you can have your ideas of God, and they really are important, but we can't be lazy because our ideas, while they're important, while they really do drive us, need to be wrapped up in a bigger expression. We need to understand that there's a bulk of history and theology that we need to embrace. And sometimes we hear people say, well, I just go to the Word of God. And I get that, and I don't want to dismiss that as unimportant. The Word of God is the objective place that we go to learn about God and to know about it. But if you think about it, the reality is lots of people say they go to the Bible and believe very different things. And so the conversation, theology is the conversation about God over time that really is important. There are things that we need to pay attention to. So why does theology matter? It matters because it's the words about who God is and how he relates in the world. And so maybe that's enough about that, right? That our ideas of God are really important, and they need to be ideas that are rooted in and steeped in orthodoxy, and we need to pursue them. We need to think about them. And it's our own experience of God's really important, but not the only thing that there is. And then to recognize, once we have a picture of God, and maybe even if it's rooted in orthodoxy and historic Christianity, to remember that God is always greater than that picture that we have. Let me invite you to think about that for a second. God is always greater. He's greater than your ideas about him. He's bigger than your particular way of thinking about him. Sometimes we build our systematic theology. I don't really like that very much. I understand the importance of systematic theology, right? That you have to think it through, and we ought to be thinking it through. But sometimes what systematic theology means is that we put God in this kind of this box that he can't escape from. And we don't let him outside of that box. And I think it's important to remember that God is always greater than our idea of him. Right? In Psalm 145, Phil read that at the beginning. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. Doesn't mean we can't know him. We can know him, can't we? But if we think we've got it all figured out, that's troublesome. He's bigger than our ideas. He's bigger than what we can build. 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 12 through 18. Behold, heaven and highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I built? Solomon's built the temple, and he's dedicated it to God. And like the first thing that he does is turn around and says, oh, this is never going to contain you. That's right, isn't it? Well, our houses can't contain him. We're here, and this is a wonderful thing. We're gathered in this place on this Sunday morning, but God's not contained within here. He's here with us, but he's not contained here. And he's with the other believers around our city and in our state and in our country and all around the world. He's bigger than us. God is bigger than America. I made this statement earlier. I got in a little bit of trouble, but think about this. God is even bigger than Christianity. Yeah? He's not contained within it. It doesn't mean that it's not how we've come to him, and he's told us how to come to him, and we understand all that, and that's good. But sometimes we create this space and we go, no, it fits in here. I remember when I was in Bible college, this was always interesting to me. Usually it was a missionary who would come and they would speak at chapel and they would say some crazy stuff like we didn't see at Bible college every week, like somebody was casting out demons or somebody got healed or even somebody got raised from the dead. And it was always fascinating. When we go to cafeteria for lunch, and that's where the real theology gets done, particularly for freshmen and sophomores who have it all sorted. And you would sit around the tables and kids, well, that's not how God works. And I remember thinking sometimes, like, are you sure? Like, you know so much that you're saying God doesn't work that way. Like, God doesn't? I mean, he couldn't raise the dead, or he doesn't cast out demons, or he doesn't heal? Like, because I think God does those things. And I think that at whatever point we start saying that God is not going to work that way, we've got it all figured out, and this is our theology, and he never gets outside of that, then we're wearing our theology a little close, I think. We're a little too certain. God is always greater. I mean, that's what the Psalms, his ways are unsearchable. I mean, we can know about him, and we do know about him, and we can learn about him, and Scripture's a place that we learn about him. But he's bigger than all that, and we need to understand the majesty and the mystery of who God is. Solomon finishes the temple, and he's like, yep, that's not going to do it. God's bigger than that. We know that he's not contained. But heaven and highest heaven can't contain you. How much less this temple that I built? And so to recognize that God is always greater, he's always bigger. But to understand that we can see God, we can know him. And we can know him this way. God is always Christ-like. God is Christ-like, right? In John chapter 14, verses 8 through 10, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Like, hey, show us the Father and that'll be enough for us. And Jesus says, how long do I got to hang around? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I am the Father. I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen him. You want to know what he's like? Watch me. And that hasn't changed. If you want to know what God looks like, look at Jesus, because that's what he looks like. Not physically, but that's who he is in character and nature and purpose. Right? Colossians 1:15, he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. You want to know what God looks like? Look at Jesus. Think about this statement. God is Christ-like. And by the way, I know I've misspelled the Christ-like on the heading of this slide. Yep. For those of you in the room who are teachers, sorry. God is Christ-like, and in him there is no unChrist-likeness at all. Right? If you want to see who God is, look at Jesus. You want to know how God relates to people who are broken? Watch how Jesus does it. If you want to know what matters to Jesus, read his life, and you get to see. We get this picture of God in Christ. And Jesus himself said that. If you want to see the Father, you look at me. Who has the audacity to say that? God. God does. If you want to see the Father, look at me, because I and the Father are one. And then I think, to wrap this up, to say this, that our theology is our theology, but it's not the realness of God. Go back to Lewis's picture. It's like looking at the Atlantic, you're looking at the real thing. Looking at a map is a picture of the real thing. Our theology is really important, and getting it right is really important, but it isn't God. We shouldn't worship our theology. And we can live in a culture where we worship our theology. We have our celebrities. I mean, you know who mine are because I quote them all the time, right? But the people that we follow, and we can start to worship those things, or we understand the Bible is where we understand God's truth and we understand objectively who he is, but we don't worship the Bible. The Bible isn't God. It's really important. His words are in it, enlivened by his Spirit, but it's not him. And so our theology isn't God. We can't worship our theology. We worship God and we seek him out. And we understand that God is available here and now, accessible to us. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's right here. God's right here at hand. He's right beside us. Matthew 6:9, our Father who art in heaven. He's not talking about somewhere way far away. Heaven is right next to us. God is right. He's present right where we are, and we can experience his presence right where we are. Mostly we do that through the Holy Spirit. Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. Jesus says, if I don't go away, the Comforter can't come, but when he comes, I will be with you. The presence of God is right next to us, present with us. And so, our ideas about God and their associated images are the most important things about us, because we'll relate to him, to each other, and to the world on the basis of those images. We need to get them right. It has to be bigger than us. But we can't forget that our experience of God is a real thing, because God really is present and he's really near. And so, how are you seeking him? And how are you walking that out? I mean, here's some questions for reflection. What's your initial thought when somebody says theology to you? One of the things I hear people say is, well, you read books, but I don't really read, and, I don't understand that language, or I don't understand those books, and blah, blah, blah. And I get that. I mean, a lot of you do work I don't understand, and so when, you start talking to me with technical terms about your work, I probably, don't understand either. I know sometimes the sound people will say things to me about sound. They're back there running the sound, and they'll start to explain something to me, and I know they can tell when everything glazes over. It was like, right? It's just like, okay. A, I don't care. B, when I turn this on, if it makes sound, I'm going to love that. And C, I'm not kidding, I really don't care. I just want it to work. But I could learn it, right? I could learn the language of that stuff. I could learn it. I'm not the slightest bit interested. But we all need to be interested in who God is, because we're his followers, right? So, don't say, I don't want to read about that stuff because I don't understand it. It's about learning language. You can do that. You can learn words, and you can grow in your knowledge of who God is. So, how do you think about theology? Does it put you off? And how can that get changed? And what topic of theology interests you the most? What about God interests you the most? And what are you doing to grow in your knowledge of God? What are you pressing yourself to do? Maybe it's to read something, and maybe you think, well, where would I even start? Well, let's have a conversation about that. Come in and talk to me, or you could talk to Phil, or you could talk to a dozen people who could say, this would be a really good book. This could be really helpful to you. We're called to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Where do you put most of your energy? Is it heart, soul, mind, or strength? Where are you putting your energy in terms of pursuing God? And then what's one commitment that you could make over the next 3 months to grow in your knowledge of God? In your knowledge of God. And don't say, well, I don't really want to grow in knowledge because knowledge puffs up and makes us arrogant. I know it does. But that doesn't mean we don't pursue it, right? Don't let it puff you up and make you arrogant, since you already know that it might. We're supposed to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so, what are some ways that you can grow in your knowledge of God, who he is, and how he relates in the world? Because it really does matter what we think about who God is and the images we associate with that. It drives what we do and who we are.